Hi, I'm Anthony, a Technodolly operator, and I'm here to take you through some basics of using the Technodolly. We're going to start with the user interface, and we'll just start at the top and work our way down. You can have a stack of moves under Move. Then the next one tells you which keyframe. The number 1 is red, which means we're on that. That's the active keyframe. Crane, head, and lens will be able to disengage or engage those axes, and then in submenus inside those context menus, you can adjust the parameters for each and every axis on the Technodolly. Next down, we have our timeline up with the keyframe markers along the timeline, and it also shows you the time where the cursor is along the timeline. Below that, we have our keyframe images. It's one of the nicer features of the Technodolly system is that it has a frame grabber, so you can know where you are and which keyframe refers to which part of your shot. Down along the bottom, we have the best part of the user interface because it tells you as the operator that all the systems are working. The OK means that you're communicating with your crane properly. LTC means it's taking sync from the time code. The pan and tilt numbers. Yellow means that you're in override. And if those pan and tilt are green, that means your stabilizer for the head is on. There we also have time code display, so you know what the time code number is and that it's reading it correctly. A sample button, which is, there's also, of course, the one on the desk, play, and record. That's where you would start to record a move for recording and playing back later. And then you have your zoom, iris, and focus along the bottom. And that pretty much wraps up most of the GUI. You'll see along the top, which we'll get to next, it says File, Settings, Actions, and View, and then we'll cover that next. Under File, we have Load, Save, Save.Move As. So like on any normal computer, it's where you load a file, save a file, or save as, you can give it a new name. .move files are proprietary to the Technodolly system. They are human readable. Okay, so now we're going to talk about exporting FBX files. On the next menu item, under File, is Export FBX to Hard Drive. This is not the stream. This is just a file of the move that you've been shooting. And if you want to save it to USB later, we'll address that further down the menu. So next up, we're going to talk about move collections really quickly, because move collections are a really handy tool for going from one day's work to the next without having to reload manually several moves. So you can save a move collection. Now, saving a move collection does not save the individual files. You should always be saving those as you go. But a move collection will save all the files that are open in your stack of files under Move. So you can then save a move collection and then the next day come in and load the move collection. And it's just a list of the moves that are open in the move stack on the left side of the frame. Next up in the file menu is the USB submenu. In there, you can load a move from USB, save a move, .move to USB, or export a specific move to an FBX file on a USB thumb drive. And then pull it out of the desk, give it to the client. The last selection is a really cool one, and that's where all day long, the Technodolly is saving everything you do. If you don't have any keyframes, you're just pushing the crane around and finding shots. It's recording all that data. And with the timecode input, it's timestamping every timecode moment 24 times a second, 25 times a second to this data stream that then is saved and can be exported onto a thumb drive and provided to the client for post-production. FBX is a universally readable file that we've chosen because it's the most usable in the post-production process. Next up in File menu are software updates. You can download software updates from the internet, put it on a thumb drive, put it in the back of the desk, and then you go to Update. If something goes wrong, there's a bug or whatever, you don't like the update, you can always restore to the last version, the next choice. The last choice is Flash Update, and that's for the firmware in the crane or the desk, and you really don't want to power the crane down when that's happening, and those aren't as common, so Jan will give you specific instructions if that's necessary. And the final two things in the file menu are Restart Software and Power Off. The difference between the two is sometimes you'll make a change that the software needs to restart to integrate that change. Power Off shuts down the desk all the way at the end of the day. All right, so now we're going to move on from File to Settings. At the very top of the settings are the filter settings. These usually we don't touch. You can go in, if a motor is very hot or if it's vibrating, you can lower the gain on the motor. Please never raise the gain above the factory setting. There are more advanced options, and those should really never be touched. Next up in settings is Move Settings, and this is where you do most of your work in the Technodolly. You can access it either from Settings, Move Settings, or by clicking in the black area of the user interface, which is what I do. You'll notice there are several tabs. They refer to anything particular to that move, and the move settings refer to just the move that's already open right in front of you. Next up in settings is Interpolation settings. Interpolation settings is where you can adjust the maximum speed of the rig and your target. In this particular thing, you'll notice it says default interpolation. So let's say you have a shoot, you're always looking at that soda can all day. You can set one target, and that way when you start all your new moves, you've already got the one target. You don't have to keep making the target over and over and over again. And interpolation settings are a great way to say follow somebody who's walking, because they walk at about 1 meter per second. You can set the Cartesian speed to be about 1 meter per second, and it makes your life a lot easier than just trying to do it on the pickle or trying to adjust the time. Next up in settings is tracking data settings. This is for simulcam or streaming the data from the camera out in real time, either in binary or ASCII formats. This is a great feature and something we use all the time on the bigger production. So when you're shooting on a green screen, you have a virtual set, or now with the LED walls, this is how you communicate with those systems in real time. You can see you can choose, mostly it's always Cartesian, binary is always a great way to start, PAL, your frame rate. Setting up the UDP address is actually quite simple. Again, you're interfacing with people who deal with these systems. They'll either give you a number or you just make up a number. And as long as the sender and the receiver have the same numbers, the communication is quite straightforward. Next, we have geometry settings. In geometry settings is how the system knows where the entrance pupil of the camera is. So this is important because if we're importing a move from an FBX file, for example, or when we export the data to the LED wall, it's very important that we know exactly where the entrance pupil of the lens is and the size of the rig, how far it is off the ground. If it says it's 1 meter off the ground, it's really 1 meter off the ground, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where you set that up. And if you click through the L tabs, you'll see different, that has nice graphical interfaces for knowing which measurement it's referring to. So you don't have to memorize it. It just shows you which one's which. And most of the time on the S head, you're pretty much down the center anyway. So it's really the length. L3 is the most important one. It's the length in front of the tilt plane where the entrance pupil or the nodal point is. And that's the most important part of your geometry settings. Sync settings. Sync settings is where we repeat our moves, or how we know we can repeat our moves, or talking to the video wall correctly. So in here, you'll notice that we're feeding timecode into the system, and that it's detecting that as our sync source. And the green lights always make me happy. And it's telling us, and very accurately, what the frame rate of the timecode source is. And then it also has the timecode display. And along the bottom, you've got reasonably complicated ones like delay between sync and center of exposure period. That doesn't come up very often if you're doing like stop motion animation, live action, that type of thing. Bloop plate flash period, 41 milliseconds is 1/24th of a second, not coincidentally. So if you're shooting at 90 FPS and you only want the bloop light to go off at 1 frame, or if you're shooting at 6 FPS and you want to make sure you're not going to miss it, that would be the place to adjust it. So it's the frame rate divided by the frame rate. And then delay between sync and tracking. This usually wants to be as short as possible. Rarely would you extend it. And these are things that are not going to come up very often. And then always use Genlock for real-time data sync. Again, is something that it's advanced, it's important, but you're not going to just use it out of the blue. Next is trigger settings. I love trigger settings. Trigger settings lets you do music videos because you'll notice on the top one we can start a move and or start a recording at a particular time code. You can just type in each box the hour, minute, second, and frame number that you want the move to start. In a music video, they'll be playing back the music track. That'll have a time code. You coordinate with the director when you want the move to start the recording, let's say, and then you can play back the subsequent takes so that everybody's dancing at the same time or something like that, that type of thing. That's what the time code trigger is usually used for. You can also start moves or start recordings with the loop plate little button on the back or control spacebar, which is usually one I use. We're going to skip over the GPI status and go to the GPOs. In the GPOs, you can trigger to 4 different output triggers for controlling things outside the Technodolly. The last one is if you want to have the bloop light go off somewhere besides the beginning or the end of the move, you can program that, and it can be any length, and you can have a number of triggers for the bloop light or the other triggers. You can have several triggers per trigger, and they can be quite precise in terms of the timing. So program settings is, like basic general overage, just pretty self-explanatory. If you're in Europe, you're on all your moves at 25. If you're in the US, 24, 2398. Metric and imperial units refers to scaling a lens. So if you have a lens that's in feet, it makes your life a lot easier to enter in how many feet, inches, infinity. That's a separate lesson, but it's a great feature. And you do have to restart the software after that. So remember earlier we discussed restart software under File. That's where one of those instances where that comes into play. Display settings, you have your matrix mode, your 6 target mode, and the one I use all the time is the number of keyframes per line. So if we change that to 2, for example, then you'll notice that the display goes down to bigger pictures. Sometimes I like the bigger pictures because if you have the slate on a recording, it's easier to read the slate number so you know you're playing back the correct take, for example. Okay, next down in settings is program settings. There's a few common things here that are easy to understand, like FPS for new moves. Depending on where you are, you just set that as your default, frame rate for new moves. Metric and imperial units are for scaling lenses. So if you have a lens that's only in feet, it makes the process go easier. If you change that, that's one of the examples of a restart software, where the software needs to restart in order to integrate that feature. Moving on down, enable sampling from rocker unit. That one is a great feature. I leave that on all the time. I can stand next to the lens with a director and sample from there. I did skip over keyframes per line. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's just how big your pictures are per line there. And then down on override, keep override constant during move is another handy one, because let's say you tilt up, the director says, oh, I just want to tilt up through the whole move. If you enable override and you just tilt up a little bit and run the move, it'll stay that. If you unclick that, it'll sort of return slowly through the move. It'll return to the second keyframe. It's a handy feature, and it comes up fairly often. Next up in settings is input mapping, and this is something I use every day because a lot of guys want to shift the telescope control from the joystick on the pickle to the rocker. And so this is how you do that. And there's a few other things in there, but that's the most common use of it. Next up in settings is the camera control. It's not that common, but there are some cameras you can control from the desk, and especially like video cameras. And we have some of the cables to interface with them. So you can start and stop here. And it's also, if you're having trouble with your frame grabber, you might want to try switching from NTSC to PAL on the video settings. Next up is playback settings. In playback settings, we have stop motion mode. Stop motion mode is a great feature. You can shoot a shot in live action and then play it back 1 frame at a time. It interfaces with Dragon Frame software, or you can use the rocker to advance 1 frame at a time. And last up in settings is the ability to save particular settings like pan speeds, but not things that are safety related like the input mapping or the filter settings. Those are available here. You can save them generically or you're individual, and you can load your own personal settings from another job. And that's the end of settings. Now we're going to move on to actions. If you right-click on one of the pictures or the keyframes, it'll bring up the context menu for that one. You can name it. You can set a dwell. Like let's say you want to have the bloop light go off before the move starts. That's where you'd put that in, or later on for a tail bloop, you need to add that. That's what the dwell is for. And a couple of other things. In the keyframe menus, you'll see there's a trigger setting. And that is a really easy way to set the bloop light off or to trigger an explosion. We discussed earlier under trigger settings, and this is just an easier way to get to it and to set it up. In the keyframe settings window, next is transform move. Here you can shift the move, scale the move, or rotate the move around this particular keyframe that you've chosen. Next is actions and transform the move. A perfect example of when you might want to use transform is if you've lined up the shot with a stand-in, the main actress comes out in high heel shoes, now you have to shift the whole move up for her height. You can also scale a move. So if the move is 1 meter long and 1 meter high, now it'll be 2 meters long and 2 meters high at 200%, for example. It's great for action movies when there's a giant character or something like that. The third one is rotate the move. If you've shot one part of the move over here and you want to shoot the other part of the move, the exact same move on the other side of the track, you can rotate it by 180 degrees and you're ready to go. So next up in actions are our keyframes. You can replace a keyframe. So if you already have a keyframe and you want to make an adjustment to the keyframe that you're at, the red number in the keyframe selector, that will update the keyframe to the new position you're in. You can insert a keyframe as well here, which you can also do if you're on the timeline and you're not on a keyframe and you just hit the sample button. That's kind of the same thing as insert a keyframe. Sometimes you're not in play, you want to put it between two keyframes. This is where you would do that. Next up is our new kind of keyframes, which are overlay keyframes. These are great because we want to be able to only adjust, say, focus or zoom, pan tilt, without adjusting track or boom. So once the director might buy off on a very fast move, you will then want to go in and add some focus points. And this won't mess with the overall move. They are time restrictive, so be careful using them. Next up is generate matrix. We're just going to skip over that. It's a really cool feature. If you're in a concert, you got a conductor, you got a string section, you can make 6 different keyframes. It'll make a whole bunch of moves between all those keyframes. It's cool. We're not going to go into that right now. Next up is reorder moves. So in the stack of moves on the left, you can have a whole lot of moves and get quite confusing. This allows you to place your most important ones near the top if you like. Similarly, there's reorder keyframes. Most commonly, the director might show you the number 2 position first. You line up the hero wide and then go in and find the rest of the shot. Later on, you can order the keyframes any way you like, put them in the order that the shot is, not necessarily the order that the DP gave them to you in. I use that all the time. And import move from FBX CGI and import keyframe from FBX CGI. This is when the post people want to give you the move from post, from the previs or something like that. That is a whole nother video, but it is possible to do. And the most important thing is everybody knowing where their homes or zeros are. Next up is, and import keyframes is, let's say you don't want every detail of the move, you just want to pull a keyframe like every second or every 2 seconds. That's what that's for, or a particular position. Next up in actions is all moves. You can save all the moves or clear all the moves. So you just want to start with a clean slate. That's how you do that. If you've got a lot of moves and you're moving quickly, you can just go there and save all moves and it'll do it in the background while you keep working. So it makes your life, you don't have to go through move by move by move by move. And in some days we can get through a lot of moves. Next up is clear override. So in some situations you have overrides, you want to start from scratch, go back to the base move. Here you can just clear them out and start all over again on overriding the shot. Oh, it's always good to be saving your base keyframe moves, by the way. Saving moves and using the Control-I function to increment save is a great way to make sure you don't get screwed later by not having saved something earlier in your day. Next up, next up is the File Manager under Actions, Start File Manager. This is where you're going to go find your FBX files that you may have exported to the hard drive earlier, or if you're going to import or copy a move from the thumb drive into your path folder, you do it through your File Manager. Next up in Actions is Start desktop sharing. This is a new feature. If you're connected to the internet, somebody from the factory can log into the computer and help you out with whatever problems you might be having, just help you troubleshoot stuff. And finally, under Actions is your Edit, Move, Back file. This we do use. Remember earlier I mentioned that the move files that the Technodolly saves are human readable. This enables you to go in, first you have to save the file, and then you can modify the parameters of the move. Very commonly, if somebody from Los Angeles has sent you a move file which you have to reproduce in New York, their head had a different number of rotations. You can edit the number of rotations so that you don't have to spin the head around 20 times before doing the shot. All right, the last column of the main menu is View. The first one is the position window. I personally keep the position window open all the time because it's all the information I need to know about where the crane is, the time code. So let's say the director wants to only move the camera horizontally. I can read the Z value and know that the camera is still at the same height on the two keyframes. And that's where you would see that information about the camera position in real time. Next up under View is Curves. This is a little bit of an advanced thing, but there are some great features in curves. Let's say you've done a move, you've done a push to teach, and it's telling you that it's too fast. You can go into the curves under motor positions, and it'll show you where the excess speed is. Anything over 100% is going to get kicked back from the software. You can tell exactly, and how far it is over. Sometimes you can cheat it a little bit and try the move anyway. You notice you have the function, which is the position curve, and then you have your speed and your acceleration curves. I use the first two all the time. I don't touch acceleration that much, but it's nice to know it's there. Next under View is Health. Health is a diagnostic tool that when you're communicating with somebody from the factory, lets you communicate with them about the different readings of the encoders and stuff. You'll notice, for example, that roll is red. It happens to be disconnected, but that is something you would communicate via email or on the phone to the guys at the factory to help figure out what's up with the crane. Next up in View is our PDF documentation. So here, for example, you can view the changelog or get instructions on how to set up the UDP. It's right here in the viewer, and you can just scroll through and read the instructions and share them with the other people on set. Last up in View is About. And About tells you, for example, which particular version of the software. We're interested in the revision number when we talk to the factory. And usually I check it before I do a software update, check it again after, make sure it's really updated. The other thing that's handy in here is you can mix and match heads, cranes, and desks. And this is the menu for doing that. And that wraps up our summation of using the Technodolly. Of course, there's a lot more to it than that, so stay tuned for future versions and more detailed videos. Thank you.